Okay, so here's my new combined to-do list. I want to start with the script isolating problem because any solution to those problems are going to sort of impact the rest of these things, especially the helper commands and the wrapper script. And the helper script or the helper commands and the wrapper script are also going to have sort of constraints tied into these isolation problems. And I think that the isolation problem is the most crucial or important one to me. I'd rather that work well, and I think it's got the potential to be more difficult to get right. So I'm doing this one first, and I'm okay with these sort of smaller other things having to bend and work a little bit more based on the decisions made here. If I reverse the order and did this later because it's hard or because it's, more, interconnected and I thought I should gather the constraints first. The problem is I might over optimize for making all these smaller things simple, and then this one fairly important problem would get even harder. So I kind of want to take the hard problem and move it to the front of the list, and we're going to do that one first and let other simpler things kind of bend around it so that the hard problem doesn't max out its hardness. Hopefully that idea makes sense. So, since these problems, I'm not quite sure how I want to solve them, the way I'm going to proceed is to just throw out an idea, try it out, and then sort of use a gut read of the situation afterwards, look at how things shaked out, make sure it actually worked at all, of course, and see if there are any details pop out that are seriously wrong. If nothing does, then that's a good sign, but ultimately I can't actually be 100% certain that I've caught every possible way that one of these things could go wrong. So it might turn out that I miss an important flaw in one of my ideas during this pass, and that just means that in a future iteration I'll have to improve these scripts some more, but this whole process has to start somewhere, and I can't really gather information about those flaws by just sitting and thinking. I think it's more effective to try it out and let it play out. So that's how we'll proceed. So the first one I'm going to take a look at is how I'm going to isolate the paths, and the reason this is kind of a tricky problem is that usually the way I've been passing parameters into the script system in past iterations is that there's this local path. The local path just has a script or scripts in there that load in all these parameters. But if I do things that way, the problem becomes that now I'm trying to make a local path one of the parameters so that the user can move that local path around wherever they want to put it and tell the build system where it is. And you can see that it creates a chicken and egg problem that I'm not going to be able to solve, right? It's going to end up with a hack where you have to tell it where the local path is in a different way than you do everything else. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So the first thing that's come to my mind in terms of how could I go about solving this is to say, don't make the local path a parameter. Solve that problem. So I'm going to change my plan a little bit, it's always been that the local path was one of the things that was sort of outside the bin system or the BLD system. But now I'm going to say it's actually defined where that local folder is supposed to be and what's supposed to be inside of it. It's a part of BLD. It's user state. It's isolated from the main BLD script that isn't supposed to be modified, but it is defined where it's supposed to be. So what I think I'll do is I'll put it inside the bin folder and have the BLD script know where it's supposed to find it and get rid of this whole chicken and egg problem and see how things work out when we build around that idea. So let's go see how that works out. Okay, that's working. The parameter script is starting to get a bit more complicated than I might have liked, and it seems like there might be some reason why it won't work in the future, given given that I've seen the complexity that actually showed up in that script. But the problem is I don't really know any way to break down what exactly is going to go wrong in my head. I can't predict what's going to go wrong, so I can't do something to get to deal with it. It's just going to be something we're going to have to see what breaks down, what's too brittle, will reveal itself in time if there is actually something brittle about it. And I also don't see any obvious way to make it simpler sort of preemptively. So instead, I'm just going to have to say, let's keep an eye on that. Maybe it's fine. It makes me a little uneasy, but I can't really say anything in particular that we could do that would be any better than that. So altogether, that's working. It's okay-ish. We'll have to move on for now. The last thing I would like to isolate is the compiler flags and linker flags so the user can control where those are placed. And as I was thinking about doing that, I realized that I've always just mixed my build scripts that control my workflow, the files flags, or the flags files for all the flags that get passed to the build system, as well as the BLD script itself. They're all just mixed together in my bin folder. But if I want to completely isolate this, then probably I want a folder that's just like the root of the BLD system that the user is not really meant to directly modify, except to modify the parameter script, and that they're not supposed to rearrange the layout inside that folder. But then everything outside of that is totally up to the user what's happening. It could be there could be a root folder, it could be multiple root folders, as complicated as they want the layout to be or as simple as they want it to be. But it's just assumed that the user is not going to be throwing new files into the system that aren't a part of the BLD's actual layout of itself, right? So that's kind of what I want to do first, is pull the BLD stuff into its own folder, put that inside the bin folder, rearrange the paths in the script to work that way. And then the compiler and linker flags files can just be new context variables at that point. It'll be pretty natural. So let's go do that stuff. Things are continuing to get a little bit more complicated than I would like. Right, really the difficult part this time was just that the source command that I'm using here at the beginning of the scripts to pull in the BLD core, that when I use that source command, I lose the ability to find the path to BLD core from inside the BLD core script, right? So I've always relied on the fact that the BLD core script could just find itself. It looked like that was still working after I added the source command, but it turns out it was only working because it was in the same path as the user script. Once they're in different paths, it doesn't work, because when you use source, the argument parameters don't get reset. So you're still seeing the arguments from the user script. And when you do the trick to find your path, you end up just getting the path to the user script, which doesn't solve the problem, because now we're saying the user scripts can move around and be anywhere, and the BLD core script is supposed to find itself no matter where it is in relationship to everything else in the system. So that, with that ability lost, I ended up having to move the responsibility for finding the BLD core script into the user scripts and have them set it up and pass the BLD path, or sort of set up the BLD path for the core script to rely on. I don't love that. It was already sort of something that these scripts had to do. They have to locate BLD core anyways, so that while they're locating it, they might it's not that big of an addition to their responsibilities to locate it and store it into a variable. But it also has to be a full path to BLD core, because if it's not a full path, the alternatives are that we hope that we can patch it up into a full path from inside of BLD core by doing change directories and stuff. And I was hoping to get away from that. It's kind of a mess either way at this point. I'm not, like I said, super happy about this. I think the only way I could sort this stuff out is if I backed off from the source command and set things up a little differently. I'm not exactly sure how I would do it, but it seems like maybe I need a place where I can call a script directly rather than calling it through the source thing, so that it's more of a straightforward call where the user doesn't have to set up a local variable, or like an environment variable, or whatever this thing is called in Bash. They don't have to set up a variable for this core script to get to. But then I separately do want to be able to use the source command, because that's why I can call these functions from outside of the core script. If I don't have that, then I might switch back to not being able to call the core functions. That could be okay, but like, I don't know. There's a couple of options there uh, to how I could make this work without needing source, or by splitting up the code into one part that you source, one part you don't. But I don't really want to go that. I think that's stuff for another iteration. Basically, my head's a little bit. I've kicked up a lot of dust, just by going through this round of stuff. I've seen some things. I've figured out new stuff that works, new stuff that doesn't work. I've seen what happens when I try some of the ideas I've put on the table this time. It's going to work, so we can move ahead and keep making progress on this code base. And I need some time for the dust to settle in my mind over the things I've seen so that I can get a clear idea of what the next best idea I can come up with is. So this is going to be saved for another iteration. And next, we're going to move on to just the next thing on my to-do list, which is going to be pulling out those special ifs. I think that I have an idea of how to do that won't involve making this messy stuff we just did even more of a mess. So let's try to work on that special if problem. I ended up chasing down several paths there. Eventually, where it ended up seemed pretty cool. And along the way, I also found a path to more refinements I could go down for in future iterations. The trick I ended up with on the main problem I was trying to solve is, first I thought, the idea popped in my head of, what if I moved these extensions to the filter files, just like the flags are doing already. And the reason that seemed really interesting to me is that I really have enjoyed controlling that from the user's side. The flags file seem like a really great system. It's one line to add in a new flag. The options are fairly simple, and yet you have a lot of control over what happens, generally enough control to make it work. And when I took a peek at how it would work out, it looked like it was gonna have all of the control it would need to just do the right thing there. And so that turns all of my bash ifs into just this nice list of filters, and then a function that calls the filter, the gather from the filter file. So I decided to give that a shot. And then the other idea I had after I started going down that path was that I could switch to, instead of having the special ifs be a thing where I was storing a variable, that had an issue, which is kind of like the issue I had with the implicit options previously, which is that it's a variable which is dependent on the local options that the user sets. And so if an override happens, it should actually update all of those things. Because like if I changed using Clang, but I originally had CL in the context, the object file extension would get screwed up. So that made me think that really what I need to be doing is just doing these as implicit things that you get on demand rather than as variables. And then I pull them off of one of these filter files, and that feels just like perfect for the system. So I'm really happy with how this particular part worked out today, even though the first thing was a bit of a I don't know what I want to say. It wasn't a mess. It was more just, it was a bit of a disappointment. I didn't quite settle everything the way as much as I would have liked to. I might need to do another rehashing of some of the ideas in there. This one, I think I got it. That seems pretty good. The other thing I realized that I can use in future iterations potentially is that you can actually invoke something in a bash script from just a single string variable, which it makes sense. I just never thought of it before. So what that means is you can build the entire link line in a string and then just use that string later to invoke it. And that gives me a pretty good way to narrow down and abstract the way I would go about defining invocations for new linkers that could be plugged in. I'm not entirely sure that I'm actually going to go that route. There's something slightly too complicated about like gathering up the parameters from one of these functions and exposing them. There's a lot of like weird stuff that happens where if you make an extension and then I change a local variable or I add the same linker or same compiler to my built-in script, it gets weird. And if I pull them all out and then I have to like specify what the local variables are going to be for all time, that seems like a little bit much. It might just be better to say, hey, there's some set of compilers and linkers that are like supported and we define that. And if a user needs one, we'll just make a new version that includes the stuff they need. That might be the better way to have thought about this all along. Not as I sort of, even just now as I'm saying it out loud, it makes more sense maybe to go that way. But at least I've got this tool in mind for how I would go about abstracting it if that was what I really needed to do. I'm not ready to give up on that door either, but I'm definitely not doing it today. So that's like an idea for future iterations to work on. Anyway, this is all great. I've got through that to do. So let's go back to the to-do list. And next up, we're going to try to knock out those helper commands. The first command I did there was the BLD print implicit opts or print implicit options command. That command is just sort of a handy way to make the workflow scripts more readable by printing out what the implicit options are and sort of bracketing them to set them aside and make them easy to spot. The second command that I was going to do was the init command, and the idea behind the init command is that when you first get a copy of the BLD system, whether it's setting up a new machine or setting up a new collaborator on a team that shares a repository or setting up a whole new code base and copy pasting the BLD system there, whatever the case may be, when you're setting up, you won't necessarily have a copy of that local path part, the parameters that go into the local folder, and having to manually write that and figure out what it's supposed to be or look up an example would be kind of tedious. So the init command is just supposed to be there so that you can call that and get the thing set up so that it'll function properly. And the way it works is just by copying a default version of the script that does get copied around. So you have it in a working state so that when you use the default script, it works. You can use the local folder to actually modify it, but as long as the default script works, then when you do init in a new location on a new machine or whatever the other case may be that you're in, that default script will become will get copied into the new local script, and you'll just start functioning with that new script in place, and you can modify it from there, right? So that's the kind of the idea. But doing it the way I was going to do it with the init command was going to run right into the same problem I had with paths earlier in this episode, where when I use the source command on a script, I lose the ability to get the path to the script correctly, and I can't quite use it on the command line the way I want to anymore. And this one is, the whole use case is that you use it on the command line while you're getting things set up. So I decided it would just be much, much simpler for this particular one to just not do it as a command and put it on a separate script that you call from the command line when you're setting up the BLD system. So that's what I did. It looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with how that stuff has worked out. Once again, we're kind of getting to a good stopping point for an episode, so I think I'll wrap up here today, and with one more quick episode, I should be able to finish up the rest of this to-do list. Thanks for watching.